Let us begin in a good way with a land acknowledgement. I gratefully acknowledge that the University of Calgary is located on the hereditary homelands of the Niitsitapi, which includes the Blackfoot Confederacy, the Siksika, Piikani, and Kainai, the Tsuut'ina and Iarhe Nakota nations, who continue to steward the land in Treaty 7 territory. Known as the place where the Elbow and the Bow Rivers meet, Calgary is also home to the Métis Nation of Alberta Region 3. My name is Julie Mooney. I am a Canadian settler of Irish and Scottish ancestry, currently living in Treaty 7 territory and the homeland of the Métis Nation, where I work as an educational development consultant with the Taylor Institute for Teaching and Learning. I hold a PhD in education with a specialization in adult, community, and higher education. My doctoral research explored how settler Canadian academics engaged in learning to decolonize and indigenize their teaching and curricular practices. In my own practices, recognizing and lamenting the harm of settler colonialism, I seek ways to enter into new relationships with Indigenous people based on respect, reciprocity, truth-telling, and justice. And I'll pass it over to Aubrey.
Tanshi Kiwau, Aubrey Hansen Nisikathon. I am a member of the Métis Nation of Alberta, and my ancestors trace back to Métis, German, Icelandic, French, Scottish, and English communities. I grew up in Mohkinstsis, or the city of Calgary, and I was a high school teacher until I did my PhD in education and joined the Workland School of Education at the University of Calgary as a faculty member in 2015. My research, teaching, and community engagement all center around Indigenous education, and I also work in curriculum studies and Indigenous literary studies. As a Métis learner here, I am working to be a good relative in Treaty 7. And I'll pass to Kim.
Hi, my name is Kim Grant. I'm an educational development consultant from the Taylor Institute here at the University of Calgary, and both my doctoral work and my current work focus on curriculum and learning. I am a first-generation Canadian of German-speaking Mennonite descent, and for more than 15 years now, my family and I have been living, working, and playing in the Treaty 7 region and the homeland of the Métis Nation of Alberta. I continue to learn more about what it means that I too am a treaty person and how to begin to acknowledge the legacies of harm that continue to impact the personal and educational experiences of the members of the First Nations of this region. And this workshop is one way in which I'm hoping to learn more about how to be a good relative. I want to also note that in the Zoom room today, we have a technology coach who we're so thankful to have here, Bridget. And later on in the session, we'll be joined by Kyla, who will also be supporting us, and we're really grateful for them to participate as well. At this point, I would invite you to use the chat function, if you are comfortable doing so in Zoom, to share who you are, perhaps what role you currently hold, where you're coming from today, and maybe a little comment about why you came to this workshop. So it would be fantastic to learn more about who is here with us through that chat function in Zoom. And while you're doing that, I want to tell you a little bit about the story of this workshop and how it came to be. The seed for this workshop was planted in 2022 during the Indigenous Guiding Principles for Curriculum Development workshop series with Dr. Gabrielle Lindstrom during her work at the University of Calgary. At one point in the series, Dr. Lindstrom referred to something called the Null Curriculum regarding Indigenous knowledges, which prompted several questions about the term and the concept. As the discussion continued, it seemed that learning about this way to think about curriculum and coming from a curriculum studies background, these conceptualizations of curriculum could be helpful openings in engaging with the Indigenous guiding principles. So this workshop picks up that thread and aims to dive a bit deeper into some other conceptualizations of curriculum and how they might provide further openings for ongoing dialogue regarding Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing. So as we continue, I do encourage you, if you're comfortable to do so, to continue putting your introductions into the chat. We'd love to see more of those if you're comfortable doing so. And we will begin with our learning aims and then launching into our first conversation together. So what are we hoping to accomplish today? What are we hoping to aim at? We will identify and apply multiple conceptions, understandings of this term curriculum that we use a ton in higher education and academia in the context of program development and or course planning. So we recognize that some of you, mostly when you interact with the concept of curriculum, are thinking of an individual course or courses that you teach as an instructor, and others of you are more operating at the program level. So we're hoping that these concepts will apply in both contexts and will be helpful for further conversations there. We will make connections between conceptions of curriculum and the Indigenous Guiding Principles for curriculum development, and Aubrey will help us position that as well. And we will reflect upon and critically analyze personal experiences and examples of curriculum and or course development using the two different lenses of Western conceptualizations of curriculum and the Indigenous Guiding Principles for curriculum development. So our first conversation, we invite you into this conversation focused on curriculum concepts. What do we mean when we say this word curriculum? There is actually no universally agreed upon way of defining curriculum. So even in the curriculum literature, there are multiple different definitions, starting with different assumptions and different expectations. And one of the challenges of having these unspoken definitions is that we can end up having conversations about curriculum, but we miss each other because we're using different definitions and assumptions. The literature might refer to curriculum as something that we plan and something that we assess, or it could refer to what actually happens in the classroom over and above what is planned and assessed. So prior to us having meaningful conversations about curriculum, it's really helpful for us to be able to articulate and explore what our own taken for granted assumptions are when we use this term. In order to do that today, we've designed a short activity for you that will prompt you to think about what is it exactly you mean when you say this term curriculum. If you have a device, like in a phone sitting beside you, there's a QR code that will link you to this activity. Or someone's going to put it in the chat, the link in the chat for you, if you find that easier to do. And while you're having a look at these short questions, I want to reassure you there are no right and wrong answers to this activity. This is simply provided as an opportunity for reflection to think about what is it that when you're talking about curriculum, you're thinking about. Remember that the experts don't agree on the answers to all of these questions. So we position these as a continuum for you to think about. I'm just going to give you just a moment to do that. And I realize that that's not a super long time. I also want to let you know that we are not going to be recording or collecting data off of this survey. It is anonymous. It's set up as a survey, but really the aim is to provide you with an opportunity to reflect on it. And we'll be sending out these slides at the end of our time together, so that if you would like to have another look at the questions and another opportunity to reflect on them, you'll have lots of time to do that as well on your own time later on. You may still be continuing to look right now at those questions, and please feel free to continue to do so, or as I said, to think about those for a future time. But we want to introduce a few different ways of looking at curriculum to see if some of these will resonate with your current understandings of curriculum. There are multiple ways to think about this concept. One of the most common ones in higher education is curriculum as a body of knowledge to be transmitted. When we think of curriculum and the syllabus or the course outline as synonymous, this is really the lens through which we're looking at curriculum. We may hear of the idea of people covering content as equivalent to curriculum. And again, that's a very common approach that we hear. Each of the four approaches that or these ways of looking at curriculum that I'm going to introduce today, though, each has a limitation or multiple limitations. And one of the main limitations with making curriculum and the course outline or content for a course synonymous is it leaves behind some really important questions like, whose knowledge is this? Whose priorities decide which bodies of knowledge are to be transmitted? What is at play in this term transmission of knowledge? And are we accounting for who the students are and what they already know and what they may want to know? Another way of looking at curriculum is as an attempt to achieve certain ends in students or for students, which is a very product or performance-oriented way of looking at curriculum. And again, another really common one in higher education. This is the outcomes-based education. And so as you're writing course outcomes or program level learning outcomes, this is a very common way of looking at curriculum. It has a bit of a technical approach, a bit of a measurement focus, and is really looking at what can students demonstrate that they've learned in a course or in a program. And again, this also has some limitations. This has a tendency to see knowledge and learning as technical rather than accounting for the complex social values or cultural norms that are embedded in these activities. Depending on how these learning outcomes are set up, they may or may not account for student values and student interests as well. Another way of looking at curriculum is as a process. And you can think of this as sort of like being in the experimental science mode of thinking. So curriculum is not just what's written on the paper, it's what actually happens in the activity. So you can compare that to like writing up a lab and actually doing an experiment. It includes the interactions between students and teachers and knowledge. And it's an active process that includes both the aims and the assessments. And some of you might be thinking, oh, okay, I'm actually seeing my understanding of curriculum in more than one of these ways. And that's absolutely possible and actually quite common, that because there is no universally agreed upon definition for curriculum, we often kind of take in from a multiple perspectives on curriculum when we're making up our own understanding, whether we have articulated that or not. A process-oriented view of curriculum is highly contextual, it's quite organic. It depends very much on who the teacher is, who the students are. One of the limitations, though, of seeing curriculum only in this way is that curriculum can become such a broad and vague term that it encompasses everything. And at that point, it becomes very difficult to talk about how curriculum can interact and relate to Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing, because we don't have a sense of what curriculum is that's within our purview in our courses and programs. And last but not least for right now, another way of looking at curriculum is as a praxis. And some of you may be familiar with how this term praxis is used in education and others perhaps not. You can think of it as being much more dynamic of interplay between action and reflection. So the focus is less on individuals and more on collective understandings and practices, and emphasis on practices and the actions that result from knowledge. It explicitly includes the values of the people involved in the process, which many of the other ways of looking at curriculum do not. But one of the limitations of the praxis view of curriculum is that the very actions that are being sought in the curriculum can get bogged down in discussions and disagreements about those values, and again, whose values are going to lead the process. So as you can see, there's no perfect way of understanding curriculum, but hopefully some of these different lenses will help provide conceptualizations and perhaps even language to talk about what we mean when we're having discussions about curriculum. Some other terminology that might be helpful in this conversation, and here I refer back to Elliot Eisner's really seminal work on curriculum in the explicit versus implicit curriculum. Regardless of which way you're thinking about curriculum, as a praxis, as a process, as the course outline, there will be elements that are explicit, made public, written down, and elements that are implicit, that are built on our assumptions. And when I say our, kind of depends who is involved in the process. You might be thinking, I'm not so sure how values fit into my discipline, because sometimes when we have these conversations, there is a sense that some disciplines are less value-based than other disciplines. But I want to encourage us all to think about the fact that regardless of our disciplinary background, there are values, attitudes, and behaviors that are rewarded. For example, if you were to ask your students whether your class or program values collaboration or competition, I suspect that you would see some pretty interesting responses, even though that's probably not an explicit part of your course outline or your program outline. This is where we get some of these, I'm going to call them sort of truisms that people pass along, of things that are, you know, if it's not graded, it doesn't matter, those kinds of things that become implicit rather than explicit, and have to be actually worked at really hard to counter. Related to the implicit curriculum is another term, the hidden curriculum, which refers to those things which students learn because of the way in which the work of the school is planned and organized, but which are not in themselves overtly included in the planning or even in the consciousness of those responsible for the school arrangements. And so you can see here, this goes beyond even the implicit curriculum into the very structures of our classes and systems. So for example, what does it say about learning when the chairs in the classroom are bolted to the floor and can only look in one direction? What does an application process based solely on students' GPAs teach them about what university is like and what university is for? What kinds of learning are privileged in spaces where there's no natural light or windows? And often in the literature, hidden curriculum can be seen as a negative construct, which is not always, but because it's hidden, it tends to remain unchallenged and tends to reinforce the status quo, but not always. And last but not least, the null curriculum, which was really the seed that started this workshop, which is the idea that there's a number of things that are left out of any course or any program. And inevitably, because we cannot teach everything in every course or in every program, but the really important question to ask ourselves is, who decides? And on what basis do they decide what goes in and what goes out? So the null curriculum becomes a really important concept to talk about when we're planning our courses and planning our curriculum or reviewing what already exists, is to ask ourselves what's missing and why is that? So now we're going to go into our first small group conversation. I've kind of given a very, very high level overview of some different concepts of curriculum, ways of thinking about curriculum. Hopefully you've had a chance also to think about and reflect on what you mean when you think about curriculum. So as you get into these small groups, we'd love for you to introduce yourselves. I know it's going to be a little bit of a short introduction because we're going to give you about 10 minutes here, 8 to 10 minutes, to talk about which ideas that you've heard so far resonate with you, which surprise you, and how do you make meaning of them in light of your current program and course design?
So our second conversation does center around the Indigenous Guiding Principles for curriculum development that, as Kim said at the beginning, are the kind of second piece of our pairing in this workshop. And in bringing together these principles, we really want to actually address how we're doing this. So, you know, you can put two things together, you can mix them, you can set them side by side, you can kind of compare contrast, you can intermingle. There's different ways of bringing two things together. And, you know, one of the teachings I know I've certainly heard from Piikani elder Reg Croshu, who's been one of the, you know, really guiding influences on our campus and very involved in our Indigenous strategy, is that sometimes when we try to bring two things together from different knowledge systems without having a framework, the result can be cultural confusion. There can be mixing that's actually really unhelpful. And so it's really important to address how we're bringing things into relation. And for us, you know, as we were planning this workshop, we came to this notion of the ethical space of engagement for a number of reasons. One is that it's actually at the foundation of the guiding principles for curriculum development. And also, you know, really speaks beautifully to the Indigenous strategy and the notion of walking parallel paths that, you know, if you've had the pleasure of hearing Elder Reg Crochu speak about the Indigenous strategy, you've probably heard that concept of walking parallel paths. And this framework also really is just, it's so simple, but really gives space for us to challenge what we're doing and reflect on that. So my understanding of this framework, it comes from Cree scholar Willie Ermine, although he was also building on the work of others in developing this theory. And it addresses this notion of how we bring things together. So Ermine kind of posits that if you're bringing two things such as Indigenous knowledge systems and Western knowledge systems into relation, and of course, each of those is also, you know, it's not a homogeneous category. You can unpack those. There's just diversity within them. However, like, let's just say for a moment that these two things are discrete, distinct, and divergent. They have very different like strong differences between them. So Ermine's framework posits that, that we could maybe step out of those and meet in a middle ground or a neutral zone where we could engage in dialogue as human beings and try to come to a sense of understanding. So I've drawn a very simple picture here with these two, this is about the limit of my graphic design skills, but these two circles, you'll often see this model, the ethical space, as overlapping circles, and that works too, because you could think about what happens in that middle zone. But I like this model with the separate circles to really think about what it means, not to mix them, but to step into this space in between. So this is a reflection of the spirit in which we're bringing together these conceptions of curriculum that Kim just shared and the Indigenous Guiding Principles for Curriculum Development that I'm about to give you an overview of now. And before I move on to those, I just really want to stress that what I'm about to share isn't an Indigenous definition of curriculum per se, but more a set of guiding principles for how to engage in development work that arise out of this kind of understanding between Indigenous and Western knowledge systems. So in sharing these principles, I really want to say that we are walking in the footsteps of Dr. Gabrielle Lindstrom, who's a Blackfoot scholar who was working at the Taylor Institute for a time and had the opportunity to develop these. And she went through a very robust process of community engagement, learning from and with elder guidance, and her own expertise. And this is a really robust set of documents. And I say documents, but there's actually a set of videos online where you can go and participate in the 4 workshops around these principles asynchronously now. So on your own, you know, put them on in your kitchen, bake something. I really recommend these. They're really robustly developed, theoretically impactful, beautifully organized. I know Gabe, and she's one of the most hardworking, brilliant people I know. So she put a lot of effort into designing these, and I really encourage you to check them out. They are listed in the resources in our slides at the end, which, if we forget to say, are going to be available to you if you would like them. So I just want to recognize Dr. Lindstrom and her work, and you'll hear me echoing her as I move through these 4 principles. So the first one, and did I say it's all on the Taylor website? It's on the Taylor Institute website. The first principle that I want to talk about for you folks today is transformation and renewal ways of being. So recognizing, you know, again, with that question of, you know, what is hidden, what is null, that these things they come out of who we are, that curriculum, like knowledge, is not neutral. We bring our culture, values, assumptions, biases to the curriculum development process, just as we do in the classroom in practice. So it's really important if we recognize that how we come to know is connected to who we are, it's really important that we engage in self-examination, reflection, in actually examining what it is that we believe about knowledge, about what we're teaching, about the field that we're in. Otherwise, you know, if we don't, that's when the hidden or null curriculum could end up kind of backseat driving what we're doing. as I go through these principles, I've pulled a significant quote out of each of the 4 workshops that, from when I listened to them, when I went through them, something that struck me as significant that really spoke to the essence of the principle for me. And you might, of course, pull out a different one. But in this first principle, the quotation that I noticed is that, if we're engaging with Indigenous content, topics, people's perspectives, it's really important to be, quote, planning with Indigenous people, not planning for Indigenous people, that there needs to be Indigenous defined outcomes. And that speaks to the principles of reciprocity and respect that underlie that ethical space of engagement. The second principle that I want to speak to is the shared space or ethical space, which is also ways of connecting. So this one really is about relational accountability. And, I know I've thought a lot about this in Indigenous literary studies through the principle of responsibility. What is my ability to respond, knowing that I am in relation? But this one really, really resonates with the principle of relationality in Indigenous knowledge systems, where if we're all interconnected, what I do affects you and what you do affects me. And therefore, when we are, meditating on a potential action, we have to really consider how we might influence others and whether that impact will be positive or negative. And in work that, implicates Indigenous people's knowledges that we're all trying to do in post-secondary education, K-12 education, and beyond right now. I know some of us have disciplinary areas that impact or that influence other areas of practice and policy. It's so important in all of these areas to start here, to start local. So what does that mean? That means looking to the nations here and the territories here, the land here. So I know, in my own education, I learned about Indigenous peoples a little bit, but they were all far away Indigenous peoples, or maybe it was the distant past. I didn't necessarily learn anything about Treaty 7, about this territory in terms of Indigenous peoples, and I didn't learn about Indigenous people like in the present, contemporary, here, now, with living concerns, living knowledge systems. So being a good relative here in this territory involves engaging local peoples, knowing about local protocols, and building relationships. So this also means involving communities at all stages as needed, not excessively, but as needed. And the quotation I pulled out here is that we need to be moving over to make room for Indigenous epistemological sovereignties rather than including Indigenous ways of knowing. And I think the caution there is that if we're simply including something like, in the English classroom, maybe I could include an Indigenous text within my, already existent way of teaching and learning around literatures, read a picture book in the same, here's what I do with picture books. I could just include Indigenous texts. And I think many of us, by now already know that inclusion, it might be a step in the right direction, but it doesn't necessarily question the values, assumptions of what I'm doing, the foundations, the pedagogical approaches, the systems and structures that shape the work I'm doing in my classroom. So inclusion is sometimes a great starting place, but often we can shake things up a little more. And I love this image of moving over. The next principle that I'll speak to today is ways of knowing, being, I'm so used to saying ways of knowing, being, and doing, ways of knowing, doing, and connecting around practicing reciprocity. So what really strikes me about this principle is this notion that when knowledge is powerful, curriculum is powerful, teaching is powerful, that means that it can cause harm or it can be helpful. It could even be healing. And I don't know if you've had an experience in a classroom one time where a teacher taught something in a way that had a hurtful impact on you, or taught, maybe you looked at your own family and you thought, well, wait a minute, that's not fair. Or maybe you've had the experience of being really lifted up and empowered and kind of set free or set alive by something that's happened in a curriculum space. Even how, a classroom is set up with representation or things that, if you see yourself reflected in the curriculum around you, in the space around you, that can be a really powerful process for a young person who's developing. So knowing that, what do we do? So knowing that our curriculum is shaped by and conveys culture and values, that it could be helpful or hurtful, how do we ensure that curriculum is serving communities? And, this is a piece where our history, and I say our, speaking from this institution as part of a broader system of formal education, that we know in Canada and beyond, that Western education has functioned in the destruction of Indigenous identity, culture, and languages. So, I think many of us now, when I began teaching our Indigenous education course at the Workland School of Education, I would often hear from students that it was the first time they'd learned about residential schools, for instance. I do think that is shifting. People have really growing awareness now and are learning more, but I think, reckoning with and grappling with that knowledge that education has caused harm in, and maybe we could put it in quotes, like so-called education, because it really was designed to assimilate, to weed out Indigenous knowledges, cultures, practices, and people. But knowing that we have this legacy, that can feel really heavy. So one of the things I suspect we're all on the same page about is we want to change that, right? Like, we're busy in our educational systems and practices and the work that we do. We're like, we don't want to be the people who are causing this perpetuation of harm against other peoples, against diverse peoples, against Indigenous peoples. We want to undo that. So ensuring that curriculum serves communities is a really wonderful aspect of this principle. How can we make our curriculum reciprocal? So again, a lot of these principles, you'll see, they guide us in really strong reflections that help us to shape the practices that we do. And you might be thinking, well, where do I build that reflexive piece into my design process? And I think, these principles provide some really wonderful advice for that. And go to the website, because there's examples of what it could look like in practice as well. But we all know that it's that personal dedication to actually engage with this stuff. So the final one, the fourth one, is shared space, renewal, ways of knowing, being, and doing. And this one, you'll notice this one's a little more text heavy, but the piece that stands out to me around this one is this aspect of validation. So you'll see here, validating the curriculum through a parallel process that recognizes the knowledge, authority, and expertise of Indigenous peoples as self-determining entities in the curriculum development process. There's a lot to unpack there. What does Indigenous self-determination mean? How does that play out in educational systems and practices, for instance? But I think that one notion that's pretty tangible here is that these relationships with community, connecting with indigeneity, requires ongoing validation, and that curriculum requires renewal. I'll give a really concrete example, and that's just like about keeping things up to date. I don't know about you, but when I went to school in the 80s and 90s, I would definitely see some handouts that have been photocopied so many times that they were hard to read. And even a few years ago, my kiddo brought home a math worksheet on sales tax that had a cassette deck as one of the items that the children were supposed to be thinking about purchasing. So it was like, really, a cassette player, like, how old is this handout? And I know, like, clip art is hard. It's hard to update and renew things. It's a lot of work. Like, I've been that person too, who's like, I don't know, I think this is good enough, I'm going to reuse it. I think we've all been there. But this process of going back to community to say, hey, I did this, like, what do you think? Like, did this go well? I'm willing to change it. I'm willing to actually keep engaging, keep questioning, keep doing the work. That is an example of how I think we can enact that reciprocity, ensuring there is balance in relationships, just like we saw earlier with the ethical engagement framework, and protecting Indigenous knowledges, again, knowing that there's that legacy of harm in the past from research, from schooling. And the quotation I pulled out of this workshop from Dr. Lindstrom was that the university has been complicit in moving Indigenous peoples away from community ontological spaces and removing unique Indigenous identities through processes that validate Western knowledge, history, and culture, and invalidate Indigenous knowledges. And that's something that I suspect all of us here are passionate about, or very curious about changing. So, one of our hopes in posing this workshop for you folks is that you will see, like, these conceptions of curriculum that Kim spoke to already. Yes, these come from, like, quote unquote Western knowledge. These are actually progressive models that we think really there's some space for dialogue between these. So how can we kind of find those spaces to open up and move over and engage in that kind of neutral zone conversation that Willie Irvine has led us to hope for?
I'm so grateful to Kim and Aubrey for sharing the theoretical kind of background that they've just shared with us. I'm going to be asking you some questions that I think are going to challenge you. They certainly have challenged me in my own practice. So in my research, I did a study that was entitled Towards Decolonizing and Indigenizing Teaching and Curricular Practices. It was a narrative inquiry that was grounded in place in Amiskwashi, Waskagan, Treaty 6 territory and the homeland of the Métis. And it was grounded in relationship with both non-Indigenous and Indigenous scholars, elders, and community members. And it took place through the University of Alberta during the COVID-19 pandemic. So all of the conversations that I had, the research conversations, took place online. And this study, it was a narrative inquiry with 3 settler Canadian professors. So I engaged with them in their stories of experience of participating in a faculty learning community on indigenization. And that word indigenization I used because it was what their faculty learning community was called. Although I think there's good reason to tease apart that word and critique it. And we co-composed their stories of experience into 3 narrative accounts. Once those were ready, I analyzed all of those accounts to see what the emergent resonant threads were across their stories. And that's what I'm going to share with you today. So I'm going to highlight for you 3 of the resonant threads that emerged from this study. They are ongoing learning towards empathy and social mindedness. And we've already talked a little bit through the guiding principles that Dr. Lindstrom shared with us and that Aubrey kind of highlighted today in her presentation. That this is an ongoing process, that this isn't about kind of getting to a final place where we say, oh, now the curriculum is decolonized, or the curriculum is ethical. We want to be on an ongoing journey of learning about this work that is inflected with our own self-reflection, so that we're kind of all the way along that journey, we're thinking about, what's my positionality in this, and how am I interacting with this work with empathy, in a relational way or a socially minded way. So that was one of the resonant threads that emerged from this study. The other was around epistemological and ontological dissonance. And here, if you think about the 2 circles that Aubrey showed us, and that ethical space of Willie Ermine that is the in-between space, the sort of the space where the 2 worlds come together, and there is a bit of a neutral zone there where we're experimenting with each other. We're in dialogue, and we're trying to grapple with what it means to live alongside each other and to work along these 2 parallel pathways in a good way. Well, when we enter that space, we might come up against some epistemological and ontological dissonance, because we come from quite distinct and disparate orientations or worldviews or ways of knowledge creation. And so we need to be prepared for what that means to encounter dissonance and discord, and how we're going to ethically engage with that, and to honor relationship through that work. And then the third resonant thread that I'll share with you today is around unsettling of settlers. And I'll refer to Paulette Reagan's foundational book, Unsettling the Settler Within, that is Canadian-based. It looks at the Indian residential school system and what it means for non-Indigenous settler Canadians to engage in the work of reconciliation, or moving towards reconciliation with Indigenous people. And this is I think, critical to the work of renewed curriculum making that we're trying to talk about today. And that is that that we settlers need to open ourselves to being unsettled, to experiencing moments of discomfort and discord and to feeling not at ease with what's happening, because in order to open ourselves to these vastly different ways of thinking and being, doing and connecting, it is going to be unsettling. It is going to shake things up and disrupt what has become habitual or easy for us. And so with those resonant threads, and let me just highlight that these resonant threads are not meant to be sort of prescriptive or a clear pathway, but they are meant to kind of guide this work and lead to further reflection about our own place in this work. So I'll now invite you to just take a moment for some individual reflection on these questions. Think about a program or a course you are currently designing or teaching. And having looked at the Indigenous Guiding Principles for curriculum development, can you give an example of how the curriculum you are developing or teaching engages or doesn't engage with a particular principle? And how might the conceptions of curriculum that Kim shared with us help you find pathways into this work? How might you adjust, transform, and renew the curriculum from this program or course in accordance with these guiding principles and the conceptions of curriculum? So at this point, I'd like to invite us, anyone who would like to share what was discussed in their breakout room, to share what emerged as significant for you in either your individual reflection or in your small group discussion. And this isn't so much a reporting back from the groups. We don't need to do that, but really just what's resonant for you in this moment? What's kind of either left you stumped or lit your heart on fire, or what's kind of moving for you in this work at the moment? And I'll invite anyone to unmute their microphone and open up their camera and speak, or if you'd prefer, you can always add something to the chat and share with us that way.
Hey, yeah, I think the thing that's kind of really resonating for me is this idea that a lot of us are engaging with this, but still kind of struggling with it, and that makes it a little bit more comfortable, I think, weirdly. So that's kind of one thing I'm really taking away from today and the conversations that I've had.
Thank you. Yeah. I think one of the things that Dr. Lindstrom said in one of her workshops that you can view later is, if you're not struggling with this, you're probably not doing it right. So this is hard. This is, and the struggle is where the deep learning is going to reach us. So yeah, embrace the struggle. I'll be in it with you, right alongside you. Okay, over to Shannon.
I was actually going to say the same thing. That was exactly. And Aubrey shared something about her. I can't remember what it was. Gentle failure. I can't remember what you said. But I just thought, oh, yes, that is exactly what I'm talking about. I need to give myself and those around me more permission to try this and it not be okay on the first go. And that's all right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember one of my mentors saying, we had an interview. It's a long story about why we're talking, but he was just like, where else in your life do you expect to get everything right on the first try? Like, just try, like, get in there and learn, make mistakes. It's okay. Yeah. Like, obviously with good intentions and take any gentle corrections that you get, but it's worth that. The struggling is, as Julie said, that's really where the magic happens. So it's really wonderful to see so many of you here today, willing to engage and connect and listen and share and struggle together. So thank you so much for that relational work and learning.